But anyway, look, thanks for coming in. I'm going to spend 20 minutes now dealing with something that I hope you'll find very compelling. Certainly got a good reception this morning down at Insurance House, where I'm going to end with the current cladding controversy and the insurance crisis about that. I'm currently acting for the building surveyor in that proceeding, and we're frantically working on closing submissions, which are due at 12 o'clock tomorrow. After a 6-week trial, and then the closing submissions will finish on Thursday, and then Justice Woodward will hand down his decision, which regardless will almost certainly go on appeal. So it's a compelling case, but what's more compelling about it is the focus it's put on the insurance industry and the demand it's going to put on brokers far and wide, and also that in context with the Royal Commission, we thought it was appropriate to really look at, well, what is the pressure points on brokers at the moment? And Gary's going to talk about the current state of the market and some sets of figures which I find absolutely startling. So what I'm disappointed about is there's so few people to share the magic, but I'm sure you guys can be amongst the privileged few. All right, what I'm going to talk about quickly today is what issues there are for brokers in the market at the current time. And I think what Lacrosse has really done is really put a focus on mandatory insurance requirements. Now, if you are writing PI, this is no longer something that you can say, you can sort of plead ignorance of, or just I don't really have to be across that. As a broker, the mandatory insurance requirements and knowledge of them if you're broking PI is mandatory for all brokers in that area. And this is the checklist as to the way this now works. Now, to put some history around this, the first time that registration requirements for professionals was tied to the amount of insurance you could get in the market was back in 1993 when Jeff Maisel, who was the senior partner here for about 30 years, still the best insurance lawyer I've ever met, probably the best lawyer I've ever met, was retained by the Victorian government to draft the Building Act, which is what we're litigating over at the moment in the Lacrosse Tower litigation. And it was Jeff that actually introduced a requirement that your right to be registered as a building practitioner was tied to your insurance requirements. So that if you didn't actually meet the requisite insurance, you couldn't work as a builder. And this was one way of actually weeding out bad operators, that if they had a bad claims history and they couldn't get insurance, well, they weren't going to be able to be registered. And so that was groundbreaking at the time. I think it was close to a world first, but 25 years on, this is now the dominant way that insurance and registration as professionals works. But it's done a number of different ways. So you can either have it legislated under statute, which it is for builders, and I'll do a summary of this in a moment. It can be under a cap liability scheme, which is the way professions can cap their liability under the Professional Standards Act, and the gatekeeper for that is the Professional Standards Council. And or you can just have a minimum requirement for registration imposed by a regulator, like as in the case of financial planners and insurance brokers, ASIC. Now, you've got to know which one applies as a broker. Doing PI, this isn't an if or must. This is just something you have to know. You can't come up with a profession now that doesn't have some degree of minimum insurance requirement imposed on them. And the clients have to know whether or not the policy you're broking for them is actually going to meet that standard or not, right? This isn't something you can turn around and say, oh, I will just get the cover you want. You can do that, but you've got to say to them, but just so that you know, you are not meeting the minimum insurance standards that apply to you. And this is because obtaining insurance for your clients really becomes mission critical, right? They can't practice without it in most circumstances. And so if it's no insurance, no practice, every year around renewal time, you become their most important person. And how you leverage of that relationship, good brokers who run profitable businesses do this extremely well. The ones who don't, just sort of slip in behind and hope it all works out. Now, this table, and again, I've set this all out in the paper, so hopefully you can take this away and study it. I'm not going to go into it in detail. It is pretty dry, but this just gives you a summary of the way this all pieces together. For valuers, right? They're actually an unregulated profession in Victoria. There are valuation registration acts in other states that don't really impact on this. The fact is it's self-regulated. The way you get authority to work as a valuer is that you're a certified practicing valuer, which is a certificate issued by the API as a self-regulating organisation, and clients make it a condition of the requirement for appointment of that work that you actually be a CPV. But the minimum insurance requirements they have are a condition of their capped liability scheme, for which they're all members. And I've given you the link to the Professional Standards Council website where you can get on, find the minimum insurance standards. If you've got your client, they've got to have a policy that meets those minimum requirements. The same applies in relation to accountants. If you get on the PSC website, it's pretty easy to do. You'll see there's about 3 schemes applying to accountants. Same with engineers. Cap liability scheme, minimum insurance requirements set out under it. Then it gets a little bit more complicated. For financial advisors, there's no cap scheme and there's no real statutory limit. There's just this wonderful behemoth called Regulatory Guide 126, issued by ASIC, that you've got to sit there and try and work out what the hell it means, and work out what is adequate insurance and all of that sort of crap. We argued about that at length in the Banksia case, as to whether or not a particular policy met that guideline. It's in chronic need of review. That hasn't actually happened yet, but a working understanding of the way that regulatory guide reads is critical if you're providing PI to financial advisors or stockbrokers or anyone in that scheme. Now, architects, no cap, minimum requirements as a condition of registration, and lawyers have a variety of cap liability schemes. But it's building professionals that it's the most troubling. There's actually a ministerial order, the most recent one in Victoria from 2005, similar ministerial orders right around the country, and that is a condition of registration. And this is actually, I'm going to pause there for a moment because I want to get to the lacrosse stuff, but there is a very, very interesting issue that is happening in relation to the way the government and its statutory authorities are going to move this condition of registration to try and keep insurance in the market to meet the cost of replacement of ACP. Maybe I'm being a little bit cynical, or maybe after 28 years of doing this, I've just got a fair idea of the way things really work. In relation to health professionals, since APRA came in 2010 to be the one national regulator for all of the medical professions and allied health professions, the minimum insurance requirements are a condition of registration under the national law. We have presented on this previously in this seminar series. There's now, 610 registered professions, and they all have slightly different requirements in relation to the insurance that they're obliged to have. Once again, they need to provide that cover as a condition of their registration. So if they come to you, the first thing you need to do is understand what the minimum insurance requirements and make sure that they're meeting them. And that table sets out all of the things you would expect: minimum cover, amount, whether run-off cover, the retroactive date, etc., etc. So if you want to come into that market, this is the start. So that's really just a bit of a boring but important part. Now I'm just going to go on some recent case for brokers, then unlock this issue about flammable cladding. Firstly, just a little bit of a reminder for brokers, or really any individual professional person, that personal liability is still alive and well. As professional people, you owe a personal duty to your clients, whether you're working as an employee or not. There's been I deal with this in the paper. There's a High Court case called Horton and Arms, which removes this as any doubt about this issue. So as individuals, even though you're entitled to an indemnity from your employer, you have a personal liability, and this creates a problem if your employer sells their business and is wound up. There's no one around to maintain a policy of insurance that has your name on it as a past employee. So if you get sued personally, there's no cover for you. And that's what's happened in this case of Kendirian V Jackson. Jackson worked as an employee. The business was then sold. And over a period of time, the vendor company that was sold was wound up. So that company was no longer there. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But a client then got caught up in a financial loss that led to them being sued personally, and they turned around and said, well, my broker at the time should have organised run-off cover for me. Worked out that the broker, as in the employer, was no longer there. The individual got sued personally. Application was made to strike out the proceeding on the basis that she was just acting as an employee, and you couldn't actually specify the particular thing she was supposed to have done wrong. And the District Court of New South Wales said, no, we're happy to change your pleading a little bit, allege what it is that she did wrong personally, and we'll let the case go through to trial. Okay, so that's that decision there that you can go and have a quick look at. So personal exposure is alive and well, and the big risk really, it's not so much that you're going to get sued day in, day out, but if your former employer is wound up or goes into liquidation, then there's no policy of insurance that's being kept to cover you in the event that a client comes after you at a later date. And that is a problem across all professions, and that's why run-off cover is mandated but rarely provided. Just another interesting little case because I know that this happens quite a bit for brokers that are doing householders cover. It's always that one when the house starts getting renovated and they come to the broker and say, is this a problem? Well, yes, it is, because under the standard householders policy, there's an exclusion for contract works. So the moment the builders come in, even if you're living in the rooms upstairs, which is what I'm proposing to do next February, as we go through renovation number 7 at our house, don't worry. My wife and I just get along fine, we just can't agree on anything. And so this is what happened here. The McMurrays went in to do renovations. They retained Mossman Bay Construction Company, Proprietary Limited, to do the renovation. I can't remember if they moved out or not, but their house was destroyed by fire during construction works. They went to their broker. The broker notified AIG. And AIG said, well, there's a contract works exclusion. Now, at that point, really, as a broker, you should be saying there's a contract works exclusion. I'm not even sure we should bother notifying AIG about this one. But they did. So AIG denied indemnity. That sent the broker into a bit of a tailspin. Everyone got sued, the builder, the broker, and then the contractor, and then also Tokyo. And it was Tokyo who would provide the contractors all risk policy to Mossman Bay. And so in the pursuit of insurance coverage to cover the loss of the fire, the McMurrays sued the contractor. It was actually, funnily enough, a painter that caused the fire. I don't quite know how that happened, but anyway, the painter did, and the painter went to Tokyo and said, look, I'm a subcontractor covered under the contractor's all risk policy. You need to cover my liability to the McMurrays for causing the fire damage to their house. Now, at this point, you know, occasionally, I know we've been seeing a lot in the Royal Commission about how the finance industry just lets us down every now and again. Tokyo actually put forward an argument that even though the policy actually clearly covered, this is the Mossman Bay policy, clearly covered all principals, contractors and subcontractors, that the subcontractor, being the painter, was not actually covered because he was not a named insured. Now, this argument was put up, and fortunately on a preliminary point, Justice Cheney in the Supreme Court said this: the expressions "you" and "insured" are both defined in item 26 of the definitions and therefore bear the same meaning and are interchangeable. That meaning is a personal legal entity named in the schedule. The schedule uses the expression "insured," which it identifies as Mossman Bay Construction or principals, contractors and subcontractors, right? Now, really, you look at that and you say, look, come on, they're clearly a subcontractor. Jesus, just cover them. But Tokyo contends that named, it necessarily means named by a proper noun. I reject that contention. The difficulty with Tokyo's construction is that it fails to give meaning to the inclusion of the words in all principals, contractors and subcontractors where they appear in the schedule. So it was upheld. Just another one that renovation works to private houses is problematic from an insurance point of view. A couple of key messages. If you, the broker, understand about the contract works exclusion in virtually all householders' policies, and if there is a problem, explain to your client that it's really the contractor's all risk policy that's going to respond. All right, now to the cladding controversy. So you're going to get one of the biggest insurance and liability issues currently, well, that I've seen in my time in the law, and I'm going to give it to you in 5 minutes, all right? Partly because I am all across this and partly because I'm a bit sick of talking about it as well, which is what you get to on the last few days of a 6-week trial. This is a photo of the La Crosse fire. You can actually see the point of ignition there, and then an escalation of fire up the side of the building. Now that happened in a matter of nanoseconds. You have the point of ignition, which was an overloaded balcony, Department 805, that currently had a couple of French tenants in there, smoking joints. They'd put tin foil over the smoke detectors, had loaded up the balcony with, heaps of outdoor furniture equipment. That had obviously, they'd put a joint out in a yogurt cup. That ignited the plastic, ignited all of the fire load on the balcony, and it clearly got to temperatures well above 600 or 700 degrees. What happened then is a matter of argument in the trial at the moment as to exactly how the ignition actually happened on the balcony, but safe to say that this building had an uninterrupted line of aluminium composite panelling that was ignited at the flash point, and then it raced up the side of the building. Now, the way these cladding fires worked was unexpected. I've certainly sat and listened to all the expert evidence now in this trial, which is people can be extremely clever as to So maybe we should have seen this coming, but no one thought that ACP, when it was ignited, was going to behave in this way. And what it actually did is that the fire at that point of ignition gets very hot, and actually the aluminium the aluminium laminate actually buckles. The core underneath it, which is flammable, then ignites, and then it actually goes up, and then it pops up the next aluminium, pops up the next aluminium. And the conventional thought was that all of these were actually sealed at the edges, so there wasn't actually going to be the fire spread, but it behaved in a different way. And for people who've done fire cases, and I know Gary's done many over the years, it's amazing in one sense how much we know and how little we really know as to exactly how a fire gets started and how it's going to spread. Now, this happened in 2014. Prior to that, there had been some cladding fires in Dubai and in Europe, one in Atlantic City in 2007. Despite the use of aluminium composite panelling, which has been around for 40 years, the primary product was manufactured by Alcoa, which is an Australian product. It was called a Luca Bond. That had been it's very popular in terms of its environmental qualities and also the fact that it looks very good. And then so we came to the La Crosse fire, and there's been an outrage which went into white heat intensity following the deaths in the Grenfell Tower disaster in the UK. Now, if you get onto YouTube and just put in cladding fires, you'll see plenty of video as to the way the fire spread happens, and it's quite clearly undesirable. But one feature, and also you get molting debris that falls off, and you actually get this race up the side. Now, the basic idea of fire design for our high-rise buildings, or really for any building, is that if a fire starts in one occupancy, you want it to stay there. So the occupancies are all fire retardant buildings. The idea is that the fire's supposed to start, it gets extinguished by sprinklers there and not move somewhere else. And obviously it's undesirable if the fire can get to the outside of the building and then race up the building and then start igniting other occupancies. So it's clearly undesirable. But we just need to get this in context. The total property damage in the La Crosse fire is $6 million, right, for replacing the burnt panels. The cost of replacing the unburnt panels is a regulatory decision made by the City of Melbourne saying that, well, now all the ACP's got to come off the building, right? So you need to put some scaffolding up there, and it's going to cost about $15 to $18 million to remove all of that ACP. And this is where the controversy really arises. Having a fire and property damage is one thing. That does not cause an insurance crisis, right? We're not going to have a lot of fires in buildings. ACP is not like asbestos. It needs to be lit to be a problem, right? Asbestos of itself, just its very existence would kill you. ACP is on buildings, and it's only a problem if you start a fire. So what should we actually do with it? Right, what is the solution in relation to this, and where does insurance fit in? To explain this, I've firstly got to explain as to how ACP ended up on buildings, right? And this is all governed by the Performance Code for Buildings in Australia, which is known as the Building Code of Australia, which was started in 1997. And what the Building Code of Australia did, and really why I think you've got a difference in Australia than you do have overseas, is that we actually do have an extremely good code. And it has been mandated for ever since 1997, and really before that, any high-rise building needs to be extensively sprinkled. And the one thing I have learned from this case is that water is a really good thing when you've got a fire. It tends to put it out. And if you've got sprinklers there, fires do tend to get put out. And so the way the BCA works is it really gives flexibility. And ultimately, it works really, really well to get this described as this huge outrage where everyone's been let down, I think really does overstate it. But there are really two ways that a product ends up on a building. The first one is what's called a deemed to satisfy solution. The second one is performance solution. Now, deemed to satisfy just means that there's a list of things that you are allowed to use by reason of just the fact that it's set out in the code as a deemed to satisfy. So it's deemed to satisfy the code, you don't need to go any further. But if it doesn't, if you're not under the DTS provisions, as they're called, you need to go under the performance solution. And the performance solution means you have an expert, fire engineer or whatever, who's actually going to say you can use it in that way. Now, the issue, and I've put this in the paper, but here's the problem. The way is that building surveyors, architects, builders for many years concluded that a bonded laminate, right, ACP, 2 bits of aluminium with a core, met the definition of bonded laminate, right, for use on the external of buildings, as defined in the code, and that it is this, and therefore it met the deemed to satisfy provisions and then could be used without having to look at the performance, right, of it. And unpacking that, and this is something we are preparing all our submissions about at the moment, there are these 4 tests as to whether or not a bonded laminate meets that definition under the code, right? Each laminate is non-combustible, the aluminium, tick. Each adhesive layer, there's actually very, very thin adhesive layers, tick. Total thickness of the adhesive layers doesn't exceed 2 millimetres. The actual glue is much thinner than 2 millimetres. And the spread of flame index, which is actually another test, a 1530.3 test under the Australian standards, doesn't exceed it 0 and 3 respectively. And all of these bonded laminates pass that test, right? So it's 4 ticks deemed to satisfy, it's up on lots and lots of buildings. The controversy is that the case being put against everyone is that this core here is thicker than 2 millimetres and should have been taken into account, therefore taking it outside the DTS provisions. Now, there is absolutely no doubt, given that there are, in Victoria alone, some 3,682 high-rise buildings that have ACP on it, that the dominant interpretation of ACP was that it met the definition of bonded laminate, and everyone was doing the same thing, right? And we say that was a reasonable approach at the moment on the current wisdom. Now, following the La Crosse fire, there's been lots of regulatory noise, Senate task force, blame game, disciplinary proceedings, all of the stuff you would expect to see, and also a revision to the building code to make it clear that you do need to take into account the core, but it's still not clear exactly what compliance actually means. There was a Senate inquiry which banned ACPs. They talked about a national licensing scheme for all building professionals in each state, nationally consistent measures to increase accountability for all participants across the supply chain, considering making Australian codes freely available and penalties for non-compliance. But probably the most significant change is that they've changed the test, right? And the test is shown by this. It's called a wall flame test, and it's now called an AS5113. What used to happen was you used to pull apart the bonded laminate to work out if it was flammable or not, and put each component in a little furnace that went to 600, and it cost about $300. That obviously didn't pick up the way this cladding was going to work in situ, right? When you actually had a fire. So now they've got this test where you actually put a wall, set up a wall of the ACP in a big room, you pummel it with heat at 600 degrees for 20 minutes, and then you work out how much fire spread you're going to get. Now, the obvious difference is that this little furnace test could be done at the CSI row for a few $100. This is about 50 grand a throw, right? So manufacturers have been trying to get all this and then set up and get to their wall test. And someone who thought they were definitely going to pass, which is something called Vitribond A2, because it doesn't have a core, it's just got aluminium, they went to the wall test thinking, oh, this is great, we'll make heaps of money out of this, all the ACP's got to be ripped up, this is going to be put on everything, we'll absolutely kill it. It failed. And it failed because the honeycomb apparently worked as some sort of flume which increased fire spread. Now, what's actually happening is that the regulators, the municipal building surveyors and the like, in considering alternate solutions as to how much ACP needs to be replaced, are doing various tests like this to work out what you can do that's actually going to meet the performance solutions. So rather than actually remove everything, you have a look at whether or not you use wall wetting sprinklers or removal and replacement or partial replacement of the ACP. And what we simply mean by that is, and this is one of the theories going around, that the problem when you look at all those cladding fires is that you have an uninterrupted line of ACP up the building. So once it gets going, it needs to have that continuous fire flow to actually have the fire spread. If you break that up with 900 mil of pressed aluminium or something that's doesn't have any core at all, then it's effectively like a fire break in a forest, and you're not going to have the fire jumping and igniting the ACP above it. But what we're getting to at the moment is that the regulators, the municipal building surveyors and the like, who's got responsibility for this, need to do that wall test to be able to satisfy the politicians that this is safe and that it will actually limit fire spread. One other way to look at it is wall wetting sprinklers and things like that. Why get focused on that? Well, full replacement of ACP, even on a standard apartment building, is going to be about 15 million. Right, per apartment building, you've got to put up scaffolding. Partial replacement will be significantly less. Does depend on the nature of the building though. If you just put wall wetting sprinklers, you're talking into hundreds of thousands. Another way of mechanical fixation that's really being discounted now, it's into hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than millions. Now, the recovery actions, everyone's going to line them up. One of the problems with this, you're never going to see a class action in relation to this because you just don't have a common defendant. There's about 8 or 10 different manufacturers of ACP that all had flammable cores. There's going to be a range of different surveyors, architects, builders on each particular building. You're just not going to be able to find the common defendant to get a class action humming. And you are talking about pure economic loss. Now, what's significant about this is that if the government makes the decision to take a very, very conservative view about safety in order all replacement of all this, you are going to end up with billions of dollars of replacement costs being put out into the community, right? And the insurers of professional people are not going to be sitting there waiting to just cut a cheque to meet the government decision that's probably going to be made for political gain, right? It's just not going to happen, right? And so what is going to happen? You're not going to have the insurers sitting here saying, oh yeah, sure, we'll just keep underwriting professionals so that we can meet the cost of these CapEx obligations that are going to be imposed on us by the government in the absence of a fire, right? It's going to be imposed on us in the name of safety, not because we've had a fire. Now, the usual culprits in these recovery actions: builder, architect, building surveyor, fire services engineer, site supervisor, and then we get to, well, this cost of arguments about the cost of replacement, whether or not it's millions or a few $100,000. Presently in Victoria, 3,562 buildings and 208 of them on a priority list. So how are the insurers reacting? Increased premiums, exclusions for pure economic loss caused by this problem, increased disclosure requirements on insureds, just getting detailed lists as to how many buildings they've done with ACP. Not that they'd be able to work that out unless they get their drill out and start taking the core out of ACP on all these buildings they used to work on. And some uncertainty as to who will be found liable. Is it going to be the builder? All the building practitioners are saying that they acted in accordance with reasonable professional practice at the time. If the building was built over 10 years ago, very unlikely you're going to find a professional still around, or a builder that's actually still around in the same form that's got insurance that'll meet the cost. And then there's obviously been lines up against the manufacturers and suppliers, but they're not the ones who represented that it was necessarily going to be compliant with the code. That was left up to the professionals. So who pays? Obligations to notify around renewal time are going to drive you all completely nuts for the next couple of years. And the critical issue now for building practitioners is does the policy comply with the ministerial code? Now, this is a really, really interesting issue because now the VBA is live to this. And so if a building surveyor or an architect comes back and they have an endorsed policy that says, you know, exclusion for non-compliant building products, the VBA is going to say, can you give us evidence of your insurance? They're going to look at that and they say the policy doesn't comply because of the exclusion, right? And therefore you can't get registered, which is part of a neat little combination of the way that the government can actually keep the insurance policies in the market so that we can have these owners corporations come along and sue them. So it's a complex problem. Brokers that lead and find solutions for their clients will prosper. The brokers that follow, well, you will follow. So here are the key issues. It's mandatory for brokers to understand mandatory insurance requirements. That's an absolute given. Personal liability alive and well. If your former employer is wound up, beware. Contract works cover, neat little problems, just got to be across it. Difference between a good broker and an also-ran is their ability to understand a problem like that, and the cladding controversy. There is no way the insurers are going to sit there and wait for billions in replacement costs to come down the pipe, and brokers need to come up with solutions for this, not follow.
I'm going to look at 4 issues today: the Australian market and some APRA data, Lloyd's in the United Kingdom, which is presently in a quite vexed situation. I want to look at some problem areas very briefly and to look at 2 interesting cases. So to start at the start, the market. Well, there are still over 40 insurers contesting and competing in miscellaneous professional indemnity. A mixture of companies, all the major insurers are still present in the environment, and underwriting agencies, an abundance. The consequence, of course, is that competition remains heightened. It's an area of great activity. So rates remain competitive in what I call the miscellaneous PI market. In the more corporate areas, the heavy areas of professional indemnity, the environment is very substantially different. Not as competitive, and certainly at the moment some significant rate increases being applied outside of building surveyors and certain architectural practices, which have seen problems flowing from cladding. So there are some major problem areas in the corporate PI area and some very poor results. The APRA data for 2017, $1,523 million of premium in PI. A large chunk of that, remember, is denoted by medical indemnity insurance, which is far and away the most profitable segment in the PI portfolio. 763,000 policies. Now, 2017 premium represented a 6.6% increase year on year. Average policy count was up 3.7%. So we can see from those numbers that real premium increases have been obtained. The real premium increase, however, has been confined predominantly to the corporatised area of PI rather than to miscellaneous. The average premium also speaks to that small increase at the margin, $1,996 per policy. Claims paid just over $2 billion. Outstanding claims approaching $2 billion, and outstanding claims year on year has increased 10%. That provides a very clear indication of reserve strengthening processes within the general insurance PI segment. Interestingly, in PI, claims frequency peaks at the end of development year 1. So if the year is closed on the 30th of December 2017, frequency will peak 12 months after. A firm process, of course, embedded in the claims made format. Historically, at that 12-month point of development, peak frequency development, 3.4% is the frequency. For 2017, a significant improvement at the margin, down to 2.6%. But it's still early days, so we don't know whether that is a true statistical variation or whether it's simply a random variation. Hopefully it will hold from the insurer's point of view. That can be cross-referenced to public liability, to the general liability portfolio, where the peak frequency is 1.2%. Gross claims incurred has been deteriorating steadily for many years now. Most recently, 2017 was the worst gross claims incurred year on record, showing an increase approaching 40%, which is very alarming because that speaks to a massive deterioration in outstanding claims provisions. If we look at Lloyd's in Australia in 2017, $144 million of non-facility, that is open market professional indemnity business was transacted, 4,442 risks. Facility business comprises far and away the major part of the portfolio in Australia, that is, business that is arranged through managing general agents or through binding authorities and underwriting agencies. Claims paid tells its own story, and it tells you everything in a single page, really, 2 points of data about the performance of the corporate professional indemnity portfolio. $144 million in premiums in 2017, claims payments, which predominantly, of course, reflect earlier years, of $180 million, a 106% increase year on year. A startling deterioration. By comparison, the facility result is wonderful, $328 million of claims paid. Ordinarily, we'd be saying, well, a 37% increase in claims payments year on year is diabolical, but this is relative, of course, to the non-facility business, so I suppose Lloyd's would be grateful for small mercies. Now, thanks to Daniel Batira at Insurance House, I am able to present to you this wonderful representation of results. So professional indemnity has bounced about a bit. The ultimate loss ratio was dreadful in 2013 at 99.6%. It's been at best a marginally profitable book of business, but remember again that this incorporates the tremendous profits made by medical indemnity insurers. Now they are a group that has money bursting out of their wallets because they've been able for many years in my opinion, to significantly overcharge doctors who have made the mistake of thinking that they actually own those medical defence organisation insurance organisations. So as competitive as Berkshire Hathaway has been with its agency operations, with Eric Lowenstein, they are still struggling to really penetrate the area. Average written premium, again, tells its own story, doesn't it? New South Wales is in blue and has led the march down. Victoria is the darker line there, also down. Northern Territory's increased, which is good news for nobody. Who cares? It's only about threepence halfpenny spent up there on professional indemnity insurance in any event. Professional indemnity insurance placed with overseas foreign insurers, with DOFIs or UFIs, depending on which acronym you prefer, we now have an abundance because we've now got, what do you constantly refer to it as, David? ACP? Yeah. With our old gems in property business. 102 policies, only 102 policies out of 760 odd thousand placed with unauthorised foreign insurers. Average premium, $450,000 per policy, bit over $46 million in premium invoiced. All these placements were into the UK. So it's very much at odds with the weight of offshore placement with unauthorised foreign insurers, which tends to be in the ISR area, into captives which are domiciled for the most part in Singapore, where they enjoy tremendous tax advantages. If we look at Lloyd's in the UK market, there is now massive market-wide concern about professional indemnity results. In Lloyd's, the concern is with non-performing syndicates and with non-US professional indemnity. Outside of Lloyd's, the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority, the equivalent of APRA, is concerned most profoundly with property classes. What the PRA is concerned about is interesting for us because I think it's on the march here as well. Their major concerns, which have been broadcast to insurers under their supervision, are about expanded cyber liability coverage, particularly cyber business interruption being incorporated into non-cyber policy forms, increases in sub-limits in all lines of business at no additional premium, and the extent and rewards offered to broker and MGA facilities. They're concerned about commission rates being paid to managing general agents.
What sort of commission rates are getting paid?
Not as high as Australia, interestingly. So they're on some property classes getting up to 25, 27, 32%, which is fairly low by Australian standards. Most property facilities in Australia run 32.5 because retail broker has to be paid, wholesale broker has to be paid, and there needs to be some profit in it for the agency. The Lloyd's major concern, however, is with non-US professional indemnity. The performance management division of Lloyd's is now focused very, very clearly on this particular class of business. Why? Because in 2017 calendar year, Lloyd's produced an underwriting loss of £3.4 billion, a combined ratio of 114%. Its investors are not well pleased. That was in a year when catastrophe losses, whilst significant, were in no way exceptional. So the line of reasoning, quite logically, is if this is the result in a non-exceptional catastrophe year, what will the result be if we have another really exceptional catastrophe year? 40% of premium is producing 70% of losses. Non-US PI is the second worst performing portfolio in Lloyd's. Australia accounts for 17% of Lloyd's non-US PI business. The United Kingdom domestic market accounts for 33%. It's those two geographic segments which are the cot case for Lloyd's. 50% of the non-US PI business from two places, UK domestic and Australia. The results are abominable. Biggest PI loss segments in the UK are the miscellaneous segment, construction and design, lawyers and accountants. A not wholly unfamiliar history. If we look at the trend in Lloyd's, you see that premium growth has been strong in professional indemnity. However, the combined ratio is heading skywards. Rate changes year on year have been negative since 2015. Significant losses are being made by a huge number of syndicates. 62% of syndicates are losing money on underwriting activities. The second worst performing class, non-US PI. The two worst performing environments, Australia and the United Kingdom. So you can see there what the claims position relative to premium is in Australia and the United Kingdom. Obviously, they'd be hoping that the performance in Canada and in all other environments non-US would be replicated in Australia and the UK. What's the consequence of all this? Well, already three major long-term professional indemnity players in Lloyd's have withdrawn. Channel, Brit and Aspen are all out of non-US PI. And for an organisation the size of Brit, that's staggering. Approval by Lloyd's, the business management division, is now required for all syndicates in all segments, but the particular focus is upon non-US PI, where remediation plans and risk adjustment rating to bring the portfolio back into profit is being scrutinised in infinite detail. There are now syndicates that are concerned that they will be required to withdraw from the segment. There are syndicates which are wondering whether they will be permitted to transact business next year. If the business plans and the remediation programs being introduced and implemented are not, in the opinion of Lloyd's, rigorous enough to bring the syndicates back into profit, they'll be closed down. There are now underwriters, in all seriousness, wandering around Leadenhall Market wondering if they will have jobs next year, which is quite unprecedented. Along the way, significant attention is being focused on MGA commission rates. In Australia, the average deduction is 25%, in the UK 15%. So you can imagine that facilities here in Australia which are not performing to satisfaction will be looking at both impaired remuneration and quite limited and constrained utilisation of security. In Australia, we have still some fundamental areas generating problems. Financial planners remain vexed. The major underwriter in Australia of planners is not accepting new business and has applied very, very significant rate increases, as you'd expect. With all that's flowed out of the Royal Commission, out of Hayne, probably more still to come, that's understandable. Building surveyors and certifiers, anyone involved in the building process who has an exposure to cladding, is being scrutinised with significant rigour. How that's going to wash through is not at all clear. When an experienced litigator as David has no idea how this is going to turn out, well, the rest of us are simply guessing and might as well stop wasting our time trying to anticipate. It is an enormously complex area. What we know for certain is that within the miscellaneous PI area, premiums for those exposed are doubling, exclusions are being applied, and the market is very, very sensitive indeed. Banks and non-bank financial institutions are well and truly on the nose post-Hayne. Design and construct remains a critical area, quite outside the cladding issue. It remains a problem area. Engineers have recent very poor experience in the corporate PI area. And I can tell you, and sadly so from first-hand experience, that the professional liabilities of brokers seem to me to be at a very extant point. There are increased signs of activity in the area and brokers being held to account. I'll wrap up today with two very interesting cases. Pacific International Insurance and Walsh, a very recent case. Building inspector was negligent, surprise, surprise, Goma, in relation to personal injury suffered by a young girl. She fell 2.5 metres from a balcony where a defective balustrade had not been detected. Suffered significant injury. The insured had back-to-back liability and professional indemnity insurance with Pacific International. Lo and behold, because insurers are like racehorses, they do know how to put in a bad performance from time to time, unless they're winks, and unfortunately none of our insurers are winks. Liability was denied on the public liability policy, on the general liability policy, because of the professional services exclusion. The professional indemnity insurer denied liability because of personal injury exclusion. Now, why do we as brokers, I'm wearing my Insurance House shirt today very pointedly and deliberately, why as brokers do we always want the PI and the liability together? So that there isn't a gap, so that they are hand in glove, so that we can sleep easy at night knowing that our client will be properly and fully protected. And yet here was an insurer who thought that it could have its cake, eat it too, and then go back for more. The primary judge found that the professional indemnity insurance policy responded. The matter was taken to appeal because the insurer wanted some more. It is extraordinary. I don't know who advised them. I don't want to know who advised them. But it was held that there was a clear textual connection between the two wordings. These were intended to dovetail. The whole point was that the client be properly and fully protected. So Justice Lemming said that the cover purchased covered deficient inspection reports and that it was very easy to contemplate, as we would all agree, that a defective inspection report might very well give rise, and probably give rise, to personal injury. So there's an implication here for good broking practice where you can keep the PI and the general liability together. Kendirian and Lepore, an interesting case because it involves lawyers and the liability of lawyers, and like most people in the insurance industry, I like to do a bit of good old-fashioned lawyer bashing because there are very few finer blood sports than that. Kay was injured in a motor accident. He commenced legal proceedings. New South Wales District Court trial in 2006, a settlement offer of $600,000 made to him by the negligent tortfeasor, the other driver, was rejected. He said he wasn't actually given a chance to accept it. His barrister and solicitor said, well, they did give him a chance to accept it and he decided not to. So there was a little bit of an argument about who's who in the zoo and who said what. In 2012, he commenced action against his barrister and solicitor alleging negligence. They immediately asserted advocates' immunity, suggesting that they were immune from legal liability because of litigation. It was held in the High Court of Australia by unanimous decision and clearly, quite unambiguously, that the advice to reject the offer was not a matter for court. It was not advice that would affect a court's determination of the case. Given that fact, it didn't attract immunity. So once again, the limits of advocates' immunity were clarified. only advice that would affect a decision and actions that would affect a decision, or for that matter, omissions, attracts immunity. More worrying for all of us is the case that David mentioned, Jackson, one with which I'm very, very familiar, because that was an employee at all stages acting within her authority, never ever believing that she would not benefit from the indemnity provided by the employer. That the district court allowed it to proceed was, to my mind, utterly astounding. But there we are. That's the district court in New South Wales.